There's a lot to think about when you first start cycling, but perhaps nothing is as complicated as a bike's gears. So if you're wondering how many gears you need, what ratios are, and how it all translates to you, the bike rider, then you've come to the right place. In this video, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about a bicycle's gears. But before we get into it, do subscribe to the Cycling Weekly YouTube channel for more great informative content. A bike's drivetrain is made up of a dizzying array of parts. Starting at the front end, you have the shifters. Now these can be made up like big hoods, such as on this road bike, or flat bar shifters, such as on a mountain bike or a hybrid bike. Moving back down the bike, you will also have a cassette or a freewheel. This is made up of a different sized collection of sprockets. You will also have 1, 2 or 3 chain rings. These things are connected by the chain. Underneath the cassette you will find the rear derailleur, and above the chainrings you will find the front derailleur, and these are called derailleurs because they literally derail the chain from one sprocket to the other. The derailleurs are controlled by the shifters, and when you click a shifter it adds tension to a cable which stretches a spring and moves the derailleur up the sprocket. Clicking that shifter down again will de-stress the spring, moving the derailleur back down the cassette. At higher price points, you'll start to find electronic gears. Now these use electronic cables in the case of Shimano or Campagnolo, or are completely wireless in the case of SRAM. These tend to shift a bit quicker and more cleanly. Cassettes will typically have anywhere between 5 and 13 sprockets. So to calculate how many gears your bike has, you want to take those sprockets and multiply them by the number of chain rings you have. This is known as the speed of your bike. So this bike has 10 sprockets on the back and 2 chain rings on the front, so it is a 20 speed bike. Top gear, bottom gear, high gear, low gear, it can all get a little bit disorientating when it comes to working out which gears make it harder or easier to pedal. In short, a high gear is the same thing as a big gear, and you get this by combining your largest chainring with your smallest sprocket, and this is optimal for riding downhill. You will get the lowest or smallest gear in your bike by combining the smallest chainring with the largest sprocket, and this is best for cycling uphill or climbing. It's basically the same way that car gears work. However, a high gear and a low gear is only half the story, and bike gear ratios are where things get even trickier. In short, a bike's gear ratios is how many times the rear wheel would rotate for one turn of the crank. You'll calculate your gear ratios by taking what number sprocket you're in on the cassette and dividing it by what chainring you are in. So if you're in a 34 tooth sprocket and a 34 tooth chainring, then that would be a ratio of 1, and this would be optimal for riding uphill. However, if you are riding downhill or you're riding on the flat, then riding the bike in a higher gear ratio would allow you to add more power despite your speed. For example, sitting in the 11 tooth sprocket and the 50 tooth chainring would give you a ratio of 4.55. So in this sense, the larger the chainrings and the smaller the sprocket, the harder it is to pedal, and the larger the sprocket, the smaller the chainring, the easier it is to pedal. Gear overlap is something to consider, and this is where the gear combination you are in can give you the same ratio as a different one. Now what you should always be looking for when it comes to gears on your bike is a close and even spaced progression of gears on the rear wheel. Well, this will come down to the type of riding that you like doing. If you love climbing or going uphill, then you might want a bike that offers you smaller gear ratios to make it easier. This would look like a 50-34 compact crankset at the front and a cassette that goes up to a 30, a 32 or even a 34 tooth sprocket. Now if you live somewhere flat, you might go for a semi-compact crankset, and this would be a 52-36, or a standard crankset which would be a 53-39, and the largest sprocket you might want to pair it with on the cassette would be a 28 tooth. The final piece of the puzzle is to know how to use all of that information when you are out riding the bike. Typically, you would change gears to keep your pedaling speed comfortable. Now, pedaling speed, or cadence as it's known, is typically around 80 to 90 RPM, although it is really dependent on how comfortable you feel as the bike rider. Seeing as gears are all about efficiency, you should shift to a high gear when you're pedaling downhill, and you would do this by shifting it into the smaller sprockets on the cassette. And you should shift into a low gear when you're pedaling uphill, and this would be into the larger sprockets on the cassette. Now, when you get to either end of the cassette, you should shift up or down on the front for a bigger change in the gears. You would try and maintain a fast cadence on the approach to the climb, so we'd recommend shifting out of the big ring early and then moderating the gears on the rear alone. However, before you shift at the front, you should try and move into the middle of the cassette so as to not suddenly be left spinning when you shift down on the front and lose all of your momentum. It's a fine balance that can be difficult to get, and practice makes perfect. Now, getting gear changes correct can take a lot of practice, but there are some things you can do to improve. First is to avoid cross chaining. Now, this is where you would be in the big chainring on the front and the largest sprocket on the rear, or on the smallest chainring on the front and the smallest sprocket on the rear. Now, this can accelerate the wear on your chain and lead to you having to replace parts more quickly. You should always try and shift gears on the front before you hit the extreme ends of the cassette. The first reasons that your gears might crunch is because they are dirty. So if you look at your drivetrain and it is covered in black gunk, then we'd recommend getting some degreaser and scrubbing the chain and the cassette before rinsing. Now, once you've done this, be sure to reapply some lube to prevent water ingressing into it and causing it to rust. Rust can seriously accelerate the wear of your parts, which will cost you a pretty package when you come to replace them. If your chain won't stay in place on the rear and is skipping around a lot, or it potentially falls off the back of the cassette or off the front of the cassette, then you'll need to index your gears. Now, we've done a video on this before, which we'll link to in the description below, but in short, you basically need to adjust the high and the low screws on each derailleur to make sure it's not moving the chain too far in either direction. Now, this can be something of a fine art, so if you are struggling, we do recommend you take it down to your local bike shop. Now, we hope this video has been helpful, and if you have enjoyed it, then do give it a like and subscribe to the Cycling Weekly YouTube channel for more great content. If you do have any further questions about your drivetrain or about your bicycle's gears in general, then be sure to leave them in the comment section below and we'll do our best to answer them. Now, we'll be back soon with more great content, and we'll see you then. Moving back down the bike, you will also have a cassette or a free route. Moving back down the bike, you will also have a cassette or a free route. Ugh. Soon if you've added in something dynamic, I could never be a newsreader.